You know probably Milton as the author of Paradise Lost, but perhaps you don't know him as his last poem, which was probably his last poem, Samson Agonistes. Since the shocking terrorist attacks that we have all been aware of in the last few years, Milton's last poem, Samson Agonistes, has been the subject of much heated discussion. Our celebrated contemporary, John Carey, an old friend of mine, Oxford professor and well-known critic, published a brief essay in the Times Literary Supplement for September 2002, in which he raised the question whether Samson Agonistes be a work in praise of terrorism. The article proposed that Milton Samson behaved exactly like a suicide bomber. He experiences mysterious but, quote, rousing motions, which prompt him to go to the big fete in response to the Philistines' request for some kind of strongman show, and he gives them one. It's often been seen as mildly problematic that the biblical Samson kills himself at the same time as he pulls down the temple or theater on his enemies. And indeed, Milton was careful to call this an accident in the argument of the poem. That's at the next slide, please. There we go. At the bottom there, you can see he stresses that it was an accident. But the political issues, which are far more than suicide, that the poem raises are for us insistent and obvious. Samson believes that his massacre of the Philistines is an expression of God's will. Now, it may well be anachronistic to speak of Samson as a terrorist, but to say so doesn't make the issues go away. Indeed, Milton's evident sympathy for Samson, who is in that famous line, eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves, it may help us understand some of what has happened in our own time. Milton, I should add, for those of you who don't know, was by this time long time blind himself. So there's a certain reason for his sympathy with Samson. So let me first read out and explain a few bits of the poem which you have on the tablier that accompanies the conference. So the poem opens with these lines: "A little onward lend thy guiding hand to these dark steps, a little further on, for yonder bank hath choice of sun or shade, where I am wont to sit when any chance relieves me from my task of servile toil. Daily in the common prison else enjoined me, where I, a prisoner chained, scarce freely draw the air imprisoned also, close and damp, unwholesome draught. But here I feel amends, the breath of heaven, fresh blowing, pure and sweet, with dayspring born, here leave me to respire." It's a young boy who leads him onto stage. So this is like Sophocles' play Oedipus Coloneus. This is, Milton is pretending that he's writing a Greek tragedy. Soon after that introduction, we get Samson's great lamentation. Next slide, please. "Oh, dark, 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 amid the blaze of noon, irrecoverably dark, total eclipse without all hope of day. O first created beam, and thou great word, let there be light, and light was over all. Why am I thus bereaved of thy crime decree? The sun to me is dark, and silent as the moon when she deserts the night, hid in her vacant interlunar cave." Next slide, please. "Since light so necessary is to life, and almost life itself, if it be true that light is in the soul, she all in every part, why was the sight to such a tender ball as the eye confined, so obvious and so easy to be quenched, and not as feeling through all parts diffused, that she might look at will, through every pore. Near the end, so next slide, please. Oh, thank you, thank you. At the key moment, at the key moment of the tragedy, Samson begins to feel some rousing motions, which he thinks is an impulse from God. Be of good courage, he says to the Danites around him, the chorus. Be of good courage, I begin to feel some rousing motions in me, which dispose to something extraordinary, my thoughts. I with this messenger will go along. Nothing to do, be sure, that may dishonour our law or stain my vow of Nazarite. If there be aught of presage in the mind, this day will be remarkable in my life by some great act, or of my days the last. Near the end, next slide please, the messenger comes on to tell, as in a Greek tragedy, to tell what happened when Samson was led to the temple of the Philistines. He grasps two of the massy pillars, and then his eyes fast fixed he stood, as one who prayed, or some great matter in his mind revolved. At last, with head erect, thus cried aloud, Hitherto, lords, what your commands imposed, I have performed, as reason was, obeying, not without wonder or delight beheld. Now, of my own accord, such other trial I mean to show you of my strength, yet greater, as with amaze shall strike all who behold. The messenger tells the rest of the story. Thus uttered, straining all his nerves, he bowed, as with the force of winds and waters pent, when mountains tremble those two massy pillars, with horrible convulsion to and fro, he tugged, he shook, till down they came and drew the whole roof after them, with burst of thunder upon the heads of all who sat beneath. Samson with these immixed, inevitably pulled down the same destruction on himself. The vulgar only escaped, who stood without. That last line is a curious addition, perhaps a sign of Milton's growing interest in the life of ordinary people. He was, of course, a radical in the terms of 17th century politics. Then Samson's father, Manoah, comes on and makes his very partial comment. He says, Come, come, no time for lamentation now, nor much more cause. Samson hath quit himself like Samson, and heroically hath finished a life heroic. On his enemies fully revenged, hath left them years of mourning. And then, nothing is here for tears, nothing to wail or knock the breast, no weakness, no contempt, dispraise or blame, nothing but well and fair, and what may quiet us in a death so noble. The chorus is then given the final comment, and it's as bland as usual in Greek tragedy, but with that final significant line, completing the story with a reference to Aristotle's theory of catharsis and calm of mind, all passion spent. Now, if we give weight to that final line, it may well seem, as I said, that Aristotle's theory is being endorsed here. But that does not really solve the moral or political issues raised by the poem. Interpretation of the poem goes back a long way into divergent strands, either traditional or as what we might call revisionist. In the traditional view, God, Milton, and Samson all line up on the same side. Milton's poem shows how Samson goes through a process of psychological regeneration, which eventually turns him into the hero of faith that he was for the author of the letter to the Hebrews. I can't see you anymore, but that's okay. as long as you can see me, I suppose. The other line of interpretation, the revisionist one, argues that, oh, there you are again, says that however rich and complex the Christian readings of the story have been, Milton's poem cannot simply be understood in terms of Christian theology. Whether because the work itself is ambivalent, it's a poetic drama after all, with no narrator to tell us what to think, as in Paradise Lost, or because Milton himself abhorred the barbaric violence. Oh dear, I'm committing barbaric violence with the microphone here. Whether Milton deliberately undermines the traditional view, at all costs goes that line of interpretation, we must save the poem from the memorable charge of that great and conservative critic of the 18th century, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who wrote, "This is the tragedy," this is the next slide, if it's possible, please. "This is the tragedy that ignorance has admired and bigotry applauded." There you go. Now, are we to side with one or the other of those two views? The Old Testament Samson of the book of Judges certainly acts, as he says, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my two eyes. But his reasons for acting in Milton are not so clear. At the same point of the story, Milton's Samson, as we have just seen, next slide, please, here we go. There we go. Stood as one who prayed, or some great object in his mind resolved. And we're not told any more than that about what goes on inside Samson at this point. He does not, like the Samson of Judges, call explicitly for God to help him in his revenge. And as I say, it's always been difficult for most readers to separate the blind Milton from his blinded hero, Samson, and that famous cry, "Oh, dark, 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 amid the blaze of noon." But no one should be so naive as to assume a blanket endorsement of all the blind man's acts. And in any case, though it explains Milton's interest in Samson, it doesn't tell us whether Samson's vengeance is endorsed by the poem. Nor does it help to refer to the argument of the poem, which you saw at the beginning, argues that at length Samson acted persuaded that this was from God. So Samson thought God wanted him to do it. The problem is whether Milton thought so and or God. And even if they all agree, it's not to be taken as a model for our own thinking about these issues. As John Carey put it at the time of that article that I quoted before, if that were so, a license for any fanatic to commit atrocity would have been given. Now, many philosophers have argued that the origins of our legal system lie in the effort to overcome the potentially endless effects of personal animosities. In Greece, you'll remember the Aristeia reaches its bizarre conclusion on the court of Areopagus by proposing an end to the cycle of revenge killing within the family of Atreus. And in the dominant ideology of our tradition, the injunction of Paul at Romans 12:19 is important. It is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." And that may be taken as the last word on the subject. But the effect of that quotation is to place the Old Testament with its vengeful God at the center of the Christian tradition. As Milton put it in his passionate sonnet about the death of the Waldensians at the hands of the Piedmontese in 1655, "Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints." But that displacement upwards is surely vital, whether towards God or time or to the law as arbiter. And it was followed up by Locke, Milton's younger contemporary, in the second treatise on government. The legally constituted civil authority may kill, not you or me. And indeed, Locke, like many theorists of the social contract, sees the need to cope with the desire for revenge as the beginnings of law and civil society. In the state of nature, revenge may be okay, but for us, anger is overcome by a sense of justice. What matters in the end is not whether Milton or his God endorsed Samson's act, but how clearly he points up the issues involved at their deepest levels. He gives us tools to think with. In this case, the tools of Greek tragedy, refined through Milton's sense of how Christian theology works. But I don't mean by that Milton endorsed Samson's act. We simply don't know. Milton's world was rife with violent talk of God's vengeance, of the need for dissenters to resist persecution, and Milton participated in the activities of the Civil War. Yet so moving and beautiful a poem as Milton's Samson Agonistes cannot be simply the revenge fantasy of a disillusioned and aging revolutionary after the defeat of the good old cause. To read it as only that is to miss the point. Indeed, to miss the point of most great literature. And whatever Milton himself thought, we cannot know. We can ourselves see from his writing how desperate Samson becomes, sympathize with his predicament, and yet still find his act repellent. Thank you for your attention. You've been very quiet.